Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to share with you a brief account of my passion driven work on anti racist psychological assessment with children and families. As a Black woman and a psychologist, I am very concerned about the ways in which the fields of education and psychology continue to contribute to systemically racist outcomes for people of color. As a school psychologist, I am intently aware of the ways in which Black children in particular are labeled as having intellectual, learning, and/or emotional disabilities and are oftentimes then permanently sorted into educational tracks that lead to much more limited academic experiences as well as career opportunities. Research makes clear that due to systemic racism and classism, Black students are far more likely to be relegated to schools with a dearth of resources and subsequently poor quality of education. This is of great significance because psychologists, who are tasked with making determinations about whether a child is experiencing a disability, are, by federal law, inhibited from doing so if the child's difficulties in school are due to, quote, environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Despite this caveat in the law, it is extremely challenging to properly consider how students' disadvantaged statuses are impacting their learning outcomes and what the school based remedy should be. Furthermore, the fact that Black students are overrepresented in the categories of disabilities that require a high degree of judgment on behalf of the psychologist, and that the psychologists making these decisions about Black students are overwhelmingly white, it is evident that our present processes of special education, referral, assessment, and placement are riddled with biases that are negatively impacting Black students, oftentimes placing them on a track that leads to far fewer opportunities to access and benefit from the general education curriculum. A curriculum that has sometimes already failed to meet their needs, hence leading to the special education referral in the first place. There are many educational and psychological scholars who are investigating these issues from many different angles and suggesting school reform activities and policies that will rectify these pervasive problems. Of greatest need are an influx of money and resources to increase the quality of the most disadvantaged students' education, as well as a major sustained drive to increase the number of teachers and school personnel of color to provide representation and shared cultural knowledge and experience for students of color, and Black students in particular. As we continue to fight for this redress, I am interested in the small, relatively easy ways that psychologists can adjust their assessment practices now so that they are being increasingly anti racist in their evaluation of students' strengths and needs. While major changes are needed in how we fund education and implement culturally appropriate pedagogy, what small but powerful changes can happen at the level of psychological assessment that make a difference in how children are perceived and served by schools? Furthermore, how can the assessment process be an intervention in and of itself, resulting in students and families' greater self knowledge, self worth, and self advocacy? I believe that approaching assessment from an anti racist framework means that we seek to empower those who have been disempowered. I draw from the innovative work of scholars on therapeutic collaborative assessment, as well as multicultural assessment, to think of how psychologists can implement anti racist assessment practices in schools. As the therapeutic collaborative assessment model asserts, assessment should be a positive experience for those being assessed. The crux of any assessment process is gathering adequate data to make educated decisions about a child's needs. To do this, psychologists must foster trust that enables families to be as open and honest with the assessor as possible. To foster trust, clinicians must make the assessment process transparent. Increasing transparency for clients means deliberately stepping from behind the veil that has historically made assessment an opaque process and that has led clients to believe that psychologists and our tools have some omniscient power to know some absolute truth about people. In truth, our psychological tools are flawed, and the results represent rough estimates of functioning, often based on the comparison of that individual's scores to a sample of others' behavior who may have very little in common with the person being assessed. Many of the so called objective psychological tests that psychologists heavily rely on have normative groups that don't reflect the learning or cultural experiences of students of color from marginalized communities. So, to be upfront and honest with children and families about the limitations of our tools is one step toward making assessment anti-racist, because we are no longer purporting that the results are an absolute permanent picture of a child's functioning. We acknowledge the limitations of our tools and admit what we cannot know. Another way to be therapeutic and collaborative early in the process is to offer clients an opportunity to ask whatever questions they may have about the process, the potential implications of the results, and even questions about the assessors themselves. Through this transparency and willingness to engage in self disclosure, assessors are signifying their intention to share power with their clients, moving increasingly closer to leveling the playing field. Furthermore, we should be ever curious about what questions children and families have that may be answerable through the assessment. So, while a child may have been referred by their teacher because of suspected emotional disturbance, for example, the child may be more interested in understanding why it seems like the teacher doesn't like them. And the parent might want to know if she should try to move the child to another school. Inquiring about these more personal, hidden questions and not solely focusing on that initial referral question, we not only learn a great deal about what is important to the child and family, but we can offer direct answers to their questions, which enlists them in the discovery process and encourages their collaborative participation in the assessment. Once testing has begun, another way to share power and to co investigate is to ask the child and family, what do they think about the results? Do these results seem accurate based on your experiences at home and at school? What was it like to take this test or to do this particular task? You seem to get a bit frustrated with it. Does that happen in particular classes too? When is it that that feeling is at its worst? How do you handle it? All of the responses to these questions help the assessor and clients collaborate to make sense of the data in ways that are specific to that individual. Instead of just scoring the protocols and sitting in our offices as we analyze the numbers, we can bring the client along in the investigation and garner their help with what it can tell us about their strengths and needs. We can even ask how they think their gendered, racial, and social economic experiences are impacting the struggles they're having in school. The goal is to acknowledge, solicit, and utilize the clients and families' expertise on themselves and their own experience, along with our expertise on the psychological data that we're gathering, to come to a shared understanding of the problems and what needs to change to help the child thrive academically and social emotionally. Lastly, the ways in which we offer feedback to families can either strengthen their resolve to follow through with appropriate recommendations or harden their rejection of the outcomes of the assessment. In therapeutic collaborative assessment, feedback should be personalized, accessible, and open for discussion. So often, usually due to burdensome caseloads resulting from poor organizational structures that leave school psychologists overwhelmed with assessments, school psychologists do not share their assessment findings with children and families prior to the big IEP meetings. And these meetings can get very large, and they include administrators and sometimes lawyers and outside providers. To be anti racist, therapeutic, and collaborative, this common practice has to change. Families and children deserve the respect of discussing the results of the assessment in a private space where they are welcome to ask questions and agree or disagree with the findings. If efforts were made to include the clients in the investigation of the results from the beginning, then this feedback process will be much smoother because the assessor and clients have already been co creating the conceptualization of that student's functioning and needs. Another reason to offer feedback prior to the larger IEP meeting is to respond to the personal questions that the child and family posed at the beginning of the assessment, the questions that went beyond the reason for referral. Therapeutic ways to offer this feedback include in the form of a story, letter, poem, or other creative modality that will allow the client to feel seen, understood, validated, and cared for. The assessment is such an invasive process, and it is our duty to show our gratitude and appreciation for the client's willingness to share so much of themselves with us. We should leave clients with greater support and self confidence to advocate for themselves as they navigate these systemically racist systems far after the assessment has concluded. I'd also like to note that the small changes I'm encouraging here not only go a long way for helping clients, they also have great benefits for clinicians. We benefit from the input of our clients when making informed decisions about the meanings of the assessment data. Furthermore, such a therapeutic collaborative approach increases our own ability to be compassionate and empathetic and helps us to resist being orchestrators of an unjust system. We get to have a direct, positive, and hopefully long lasting impact on our clients' lives when approaching assessment as a short term therapeutic intervention. My diverse educational experiences, from studying human biology to public health to school psychology, as well as my varied work experiences from community mental health to working as a psychologist at the California School for the Blind to private practice and now teaching and research, have contributed to my determination to re envision the potential of psychological assessment to heal and empower. If we're trying to move toward anti racist practice, it is imperative that we question and critique what we've been taught and what we've become accustomed to. We must reflect on our practice, how we've been trained, and what we've come to accept as fact so that we can protect our clients and students from the potential harmful outcomes that our tools, analyses, and recommendations can bring. I'm hoping to inspire your own vision and practice to move away from the white supremacist frame in which this field originated and move increasingly closer to the ideals of equity and justice that our professional organizations have presently set forth as priorities for us as practitioners. I hope that scholars and practitioners can continue to create and employ creative ways to bring the educational and psychological fields closer to their ideals of anti-racist, human-centered practice. Thank you for taking the time to listen.